Today we're going to be taking a look at heart sounds as part of the cardiology series. To start this topic, it's important to review the normal cardiac structure, and we have a simplified diagram here which is not quite anatomically correct, but it helps to present the different stages of the cardiac cycle a bit more easily. So if you remember, deoxygenated blood is pumped from the right ventricle to the lungs via the pulmonary artery. This blood then becomes oxygenated and returns to the left atrium via the pulmonary vein. From the left side, oxygenated blood is pumped to the rest of the body via the aorta, and then deoxygenated blood returns to the right atrium via the vena cava. And you can see that this forms a double circulation system, where deoxygenated and oxygenated blood can be pumped around the lungs and the body respectively. Importantly, the heart has a system of valves which control the flow of blood. In particular, we have the tricuspid valve which sits between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and we also have the mitral valve which sits between the left atrium and the left ventricle, and these valves are collectively termed the atrioventricular valves. At the same time, we also have valves between the ventricles and their corresponding arteries, and these consist of the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, and these are collectively termed the semi-lunar valves. These valves help to prevent the backflow of blood, and therefore ensure the efficient pumping of blood. To understand how the normal heart sounds are formed, we have to take a look at the normal cardiac cycle, and we're going to start by having the blood in the ventricles, which is the start of ventricular systole. In the first phase of ventricular systole, the ventricles contract simultaneously, and this increases the pressure within the chambers. As a consequence of this increased pressure, the atrioventricular valves, the mitral and the tricuspid valves, are forced close, and this results in the first heart sound being formed. As the pressure in the ventricles continues to increase, this forces the semi-lunar valves to open, and the blood is ejected into the pulmonary artery and aorta respectively. This marks the ejection phase of ventricular systole. On the other side, we have diastole, which involves heart muscle relaxation. At the start of this phase, you can see that the pressure in the aorta and pulmonary artery is much higher than the pressure in the ventricles, and as a consequence, the semi-lunar valves are forced close. The closure of the semi-lunar valves in this step is what marks the second heart sound, or the S2 sound, to be formed. After this step, new blood enters the atria, and the atrioventricular valves open. Most of the blood during diastole moves into the ventricles passively, and then the atria contract to squeeze the remaining blood into the ventricles actively. In this way, you can see that diastole is formed both of a passive phase and an active phase, and this is important when considering abnormal heart sounds. From here, you can see that we've now reached the start of the diagram again, and the process repeats to allow pumping of blood around the heart and the body. If we take a closer look at the S1 and S2 heart sounds, we can see that the S1 sound is formed when the atrioventricular valves close, and the S2 sound forms when the semi-lunar valves close. To summarize this, the atrioventricular valves close at the start of systole, and the semi-lunar valves close at the start of diastole, and we can plot this diagrammatically, so we can see that the time between S1 and S2 represents systole, and the time between S2 and S1 represents diastole. In terms of the sound quality, the S1 is often described as a lub sound, while the S2 sounds more like a dub. And we can now have a listen to see what this sounds like in a healthy individual. Having understood the normal heart sounds, we can now move on to abnormal sounds, such as the S3 sound, which is caused by rapid filling of the ventricles during early diastole. The S3 sound can be physiological or pathological, and because it occurs in early diastole, this would be immediately after the S2 sound, and as above, it's caused by rapid filling of the ventricles. Let's take a listen to how this would sound. To understand why the S3 sound is formed, we can take a look at the chambers of the heart again. And what's happening is that blood rushes into overly compliant ventricles, which results in the sound being formed. Importantly, this happens during the first phase of diastole, or the passive phase, because no contraction is involved. Another point to mention is that the S3 sound can best be heard at the cardiac apex, in the left lateral decubitus position, so when the patient is lying on their left side. As mentioned previously, some of the causes of an S3 sound can be physiological, and these include in children, athletes, and during pregnancy. Some of the pathological causes can include dilated cardiomyopathy, where the ventricles become excessively enlarged, or in systolic heart failure, where there's volume overload. This form of heart failure involves insufficient pumping of blood, which results in structural changes. To put the S3 sound in the context of the cardiac cycle, we can have a look at the process again. So the first sound is caused by the atrioventricular valves closing. The second sound after the blood has been injected into the aorta and pulmonary artery is caused by the semi-lunar valves closing. And then the third sound occurs during early diastole, when blood rushes into the ventricles during the passive phase. Following this, the active phase of diastole occurs as normal, and then the process repeats. Another abnormal sound is the S4 sound, which occurs due to blood striking the ventricles during the active phase of diastole, and this is usually always a pathological finding. If we plot this on our diagram, the S4 sound occurs immediately before the S1 sound, which marks the end of diastole. Let's take a listen to how this would sound. For this case, the first phase of diastole occurs as normal, so the atria fill and then passive fillings occurs as before. The S4 sound is then heard due to the atria contracting against non-compliant ventricles, or more stiff ventricles than usual. And this occurs during the active phase of diastole when the atria are contracting, rather than the passive phase. Just like the S3 sound, the S4 sound is best heard at the cardiac apex. Potential causes of the S4 heart sound would include anything which would increase the stiffness of the ventricles. So for example, chronic hypertension leading to ventricular hypertrophy, structural defects such as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or diastolic heart failure, which involves pressure overload. Unlike systolic failure, this is characterized by poor filling ability during diastole. Just like before, the S4 heart sound can be put into the context of the cardiac cycle. So to recap, the first heart sound occurs due to the atrioventricular valves closing at the start of systole. The second heart sound occurs due to the semi-lunar valves closing at the end of systole, after blood has been ejected into the arteries. The first stage of diastole occurs as normal, so there's normal atrial filling and normal passive ventricular filling. However, the second phase of diastole, when there's atrial contraction, involves the fourth heart sound being heard because the contraction occurs against non-compliant ventricles. It can sometimes be a bit tricky to distinguish between the S3 and S4 heart sounds, but there are a few tips you can remember. The first tip involves counting the number of syllables in the words compliant and non-compliant to work out the type of ventricles associated with each type of sound. So for example, the word compliant has 3 syllables, which means that compliant ventricles are associated with the S3 sound. In comparison, the words non-compliant have 4 syllables, which means that non-compliant ventricles are associated with the S4 sound. Another tip to remember is that the S3 rhythm often sounds like the word Kentucky, while the S4 rhythm often sounds like the word Tennessee, and this can be useful to remember when auscultating. With these features in mind, let's have a listen to the S3 heart sound again. Let's also have another listen to the S4 heart sound to compare this. To finish off, we have a summary slide here which outlines the different types of heart sounds as well as the causes behind each type. And we also have a diagrammatic summary here as well. I hope you found this video helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.